You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Christopher Media, let's make some noise.
I killed Dietrichsen. Me, Walter Neff, insurance agent, 35 years old, unmarried, no visible scars. Until a while ago, that is. Yeah, I killed him. I killed him for money and for a woman. It all began last May. I was thinking about that dame upstairs and the way she had looked at me. And I wanted to see her again, close, without that silly staircase between us. How could I have known that murder can sometimes smell like honeysuckle?
I can't stand it anymore. What if they do hang me?
They're not going to hang you, baby.
It's better than going on this way.
They're not going to hang you. Because you're going to do it and I'm going to help you.
Yes, from the moment they met, it was murder. But always behind them, with his devilish hunches and his brilliant brain, was Keyes.
The murder's never perfect. Always comes apart sooner or later. And where two people are concerned, it's usually sooner.
Could they get away from him and his relentless pursuit? And could they get away with murder?
You don't know Keyes. Once he gets his teeth into something, he never lets go. He'll investigate you. He'll have you shouted. He'll watch you every minute from now on. You afraid, baby?
Yes, I'm afraid. But not of Keyes. I'm afraid of us.
I'd like to move in on her right now, tonight. If it wasn't for Norton and his striped pants ideas about company policy, I'd have the cops after her so quick it'd make her head spin. Now, we know the Dietrichsen dame is in it, and somebody else.
Only you haven't got a single thing to go on, Keyes.
He'll show. He's got to show. Sometime, somewhere, they've got to meet.
Welcome to the projection booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Joining me once again is Mr. Keith Gordon.
Hello.
Also back in the booth is Ms. Kat Ellinger.
I'm just here for the Jism, sitting and knitting.
That will hopefully make more sense later. We conclude Noirvember with a look at Double Indemnity. Just as sure as 10 dimes make a dollar, baby, it's one of the seminal works in the film noir canon. It stars Fred MacMurray as the fast-talking Walter Neff, an insurance agent who gets played for a dope by a dame. The dame in question, Phyllis Dietrichsen, is played by the one and only Barbara Stanwyk. The two cook up an insurance scam to pay off big after they bump off her husband. It's a tale of twists and turns that we will be spoiling along the way, so if you don't want to bust out crying, you better watch the film before listening to us flap our gums. So Keith, when was the first time you saw Double Indemnity, and what did you think?
I was either, I think, 12 or 13. It was when I was first really falling completely in love with movies and trying to see as much as I could. And I went with like my best movie buddy from junior high, this guy Paul Heckendrew, still friendly with many, many years later. And we saw it at the Carnegie Hall Cinema, which was one of the great revival houses in New York that is no longer there. And I was, predictably, I guess now, quite blown away because I had not really seen noir. I was at that age, and I certainly hadn't seen anything like that. And everything about it was new to me. I mean, Fred MacMurray was the guy I knew from My Three Sons on TV and a couple of Disney movies. And what I'd mostly seen of 30s and 40s movies had tended to be more of the comedies and the, his Gal Fridays. And so basically, this was my first time seeing a film that was that grown up and that dark and that complicated from that era. And it kind of blew me away because the willingness to deal with everything from sex to real moral darkness was very new to me. I mean, most of the films that I had been seeing had been more, films that kids saw. So to me, it was incredibly erotic and it was incredibly, groundbreaking. And it was one of the first films where I felt really aware of the style of it. And I really felt aware of how it was photographed. And so it was pretty thrilling. It was actually it had a big impact because it was just a whole new world that I didn't even realize existed.
How about you, Kat?
I was a little bit older, maybe 15 or 16. It was either late 80s or early 90s, but I watched it with my dad. It was showing on BBC Two. where I got most of my film education, because we just don't have cinemas here. And like Keith, I grew up on screwball comedies. So I'd seen Fred MacMurray in those. And as far as I can remember, I think this was actually the first true noir that I ever saw, even though I'd been watching horror films and, it was all later stuff. I was more attracted to the stuff that was coming out at the time, like the 70s and 80s stuff. So I didn't really have any background in watching noir, didn't really know what to expect. My dad was just really into noir and would often introduce me to a lot of films just could say, come and sit and watch this. And I'd usually think, ugh, but it'd always end up being something amazing. And like Keith as well, really just made such an impact on me because I didn't know what I was watching. Like, it's really erotic, really dark, and it just made such an impression on me. And it's then become the noir by which I judge all the others, which it's a high bar, sets a really high bar. But yeah, it just totally blew my mind. I was a little bit older, so I could understand a lot of the innuendo as well. And growing up in the 80s where everything was getting more graphic, I was just like, wow, this is actually sexier. This is actually, almost obscene by what it doesn't show. So, yeah.
I came to this one definitely a little bit later than you guys. I think I was in my early 20s when I saw this. I saw it as some film class at U of M. And like you, Keith, I grew up watching Fred MacMurray as the dad on My Three Sons. So there was a real cognitive dissonance when I encountered Walter Neff, and I'm just like, what the hell is going on? Why is the absent professor talking like this? This is bizarre. And just the patois, the language that they speak in this is so strange to my young ears, or was at the time. I'm just like, what is going on? Like, every time he called her baby, I could not stop laughing. I wasn't necessarily one of those obnoxious people that watches older films and just thinks they're hilarious because they're old for some reason, but it just took me by surprise that there was this darkness in Fred MacMurray. I had seen him in the Cain Mutiny, and I hadn't seen The Apartment yet, but I knew he could go a little dark, but this movie was just so crazy to not even know what I was experiencing. I think I had seen a couple noirs before this, but again, yeah, just Fred MacMurray. I was somewhat familiar with Barbara Stanwyk. I knew Edward G. Robinson more as the person that people would try to imitate, like him and James Cagney were like the go-tos for imitators.
Is this Miss Primrose? This is Edward G. Robinson, say?
You're good, kid, but you're only second best as long as I'm around.
You're good, kid, real good. But as long as I'm around, you'll always be second best, see?
Because I'm black, see? That's right.
Edward G. Robinson he's just fantastic in this movie. He is so good, and everybody is so good. This movie has this crazy pedigree of all the right people working on it, and it coming together and just forming this beautiful, delicious stew of talent, of Billy Wilder directing and co-writing, Raymond Chandler, who we dedicated almost an entire month to last year, being the other co-writer, based on a James and Cain short story novella, and then having John Seitz, or it might be Seitz, as the cinematographer, and Miklos Rosa as the composer. Everything just sings. This movie is so tight. It is fantastic.
I think it's one film that I would show younger people who say things like, oh, films are boring, or they're not sexy, or, things are better now because they're graphic. I don't necessarily agree with that.
Yeah, I think this is a case of something that holds up so well. I mean, I definitely agree that anybody, for people who have not been exposed to older movies or, have that preconception that, like, older movies are boring, this is, like, the perfect first one to, like, show somebody and have them go, oh, wait a minute, never mind to take it back.
And I don't think there's a wasted scene in this film or a wasted shot. It's so fine-tuned. I mean, it's like that dialogue, which just feels like it's just rat-a-tat type of dialogue. It's not necessarily Hawksian. It's not said that fast. It's a little bit slower, but the dialogue just crackles, and it could be just a dialogue picture. It could just be, oh, wow, I'm amazed at what they're saying. But no, the direction, I think, and just the way that everything is put together, like I said, I don't think there's a wasted shot in this movie.
It's that amazing thing that when movies do right, they're so great, where it's utterly entertaining and fun, and yet it's also art. And it manages to be one of those movies that does both, and you can think about it a lot, and it says a lot about human beings, but it also never feels for a moment like, oh, this is somebody teaching me a lesson or it's something good for me. It's utterly decadent, and it's like if you could make a hot fudge sundae that also gave you all your daily or nutritional requirements. And I feel like movies like this are that rare thing where you get it all, and I think that's something that movies do as an art really well when it works.
That's the thing about Wilder, though. He wasn't necessarily attached to style in terms of cinematic style. He was really economical. I mean, he learnt from Lubitsch, so it's all about the story, all about the people, the performances, and these wonderful little touches, but everything has to have a reason. He wasn't interested in showing off. And I think that's why, I mean, most of his work is super tight anyway. There's like nothing wasted. He wasn't I think one of the anecdotes he gave is when you see the shot from inside the fireplace, like looking into a room, and it's like, what does it mean? It doesn't mean anything. It's like nobody's point of view. And he just really was more focused on people and how they interact. So you can't really take any Billy Wilder film and say, look at a frame of it and say, oh yeah, that's Billy Wilder, because he didn't really have a definable style. It was more to do with telling the story. It was all about the story. But then he started as a writer, so.
Which is interesting, because I know Andrew Sarris did not like Billy Wilder films, and it took him a long time before he kind of came around and apologized to Wilder for really putting him down in his whole auteurist theory. He's just like, oh yeah, he's not an auteur. There is nothing that says that this is a Billy Wilder film. And it's like, well, I think there are some things. Some of it is that there's this amazing storytelling.
I think that's what he was interested about. Actually, I was just working on something to do with Brian Forbes, actually. And Brian Forbes is similar. He didn't really have a style. It was more about stories. And he said that critics, when they write about film, they look at shot composition and they look at the technical elements, but audiences always remember the performance. And it's the same with Wilder. He was more interested in that character, that story, how people interact. And he was totally an auteur, because he followed the same themes over and over and over again in his work. Even before he was directing, he was still... to dismiss a director because they don't have a particular style, I think Wilder just wasn't even interested in that. He was a storyteller. One of the greatest storytellers of American cinema, I'd say.
Well, it's funny. I think the whole idea of auteur filmmaking has changed, and I think, like many ideas, it kind of started in a more, maybe a more simple-minded way of like just a big. I think early on it tended to be about, well, do their films all look the same? Do their films all sound the same? Which is kind of, to me, not even a plus necessarily. I mean, so many of the greatest filmmakers, even if they're tremendously stylish, and I think Double Indemnity style is a huge part of the story, but it was something that Wilder did for that film. It wasn't something that he then carried to every other film. What makes an auteur, and I think it's become more and more the way people frame it, is what you were just saying, which is it's now much more about themes, about deeper ideas, about sort of the soul of the movie, much more than the style of the movie. And I feel like as people have used that term maybe over the years, it's evolved to be more about like what's under the skin of the artist instead of just what's sort of the obvious surface stuff.
Well, another overused term is film noir, and we could get really bogged down talking about what was the first film noir and how did it progress and all that. But like I said, this is one of those seminal films. You look at this movie from 2019 eyes and you're just like, oh yeah, of course this is a film noir. Especially you look at the way that they're using, say, Venetian blinds or the flashback structure or just the way that things are composed in order to put people in light and shadow. And there's just so many things. We just talked a few weeks ago about the big combo and how that was just like, this is film noir, like screaming from the screen. And this is pretty much the same thing. You look at those shots of the Dietrichsen house, you watch the way that we're framed with the story around the story of Walter Neff going into the insurance agency and starting to confess, and he is our voiceover narrator. I mean, these are things that we see constantly in film noir, but this is 1944, and this is one of the first films that's really putting a lot of these elements together.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it's a total bar setter. And so many other films that came after it modelled themselves somewhat on this film, I think. I mean, it's perfection, though, isn't it, really?
When it comes to another Billy Wilder film, Sunset Boulevard, he takes these same things and just pushes it farther. Like, rather than having this be a voiceover narration from a dying man, we've got Joe Gillis, who's a dead man, narrating the story. But it's nice that we have this. And we also have Walter is kind of an unreliable narrator, which I appreciate. There's a lot of times where he is giving us the flourishes of the story, telling us his internal feelings. But there are times where I think he's actually lying to Keyes, because this voiceover is a memo to Barton Keyes, lying to him because he's saying things like, oh, nothing happened. We just sat around in my apartment. And there's obviously a post-coital kind of look to the next shot after he says that. And I'm like, yeah, her smoking the cigarette, you laying over here on the couch. I think something might have just happened, Walter. I think you might be omitting some things.
Obviously, there were cultural reasons at the time you couldn't say we had sex, but even the implication, to me, one of the things about the film that's really fascinating is you've got sort of the love relationship, which is really the Edward G. Robinson relationship, separated from the lust relationship, and the competition between those two, and different, that there's a lot more in this, in a way, there's a lot more emotional connection with the other male character. And, the way Edward G. Robinson talks about, oh, Margie, none of these girls drink from a bottle. You have the feeling that part of their relationship is that Robinson disapproves of MacMurray's whole sex life. So the idea that he wouldn't show that he would choose to not say that, to Keyes in his memo is kind of an interesting one, because there seems to be, even between the men, a whole thing around women, which is sort of a way under the surface kind of thing. But there's clearly, it shows up a bunch of times between them when they're talking. So I wonder if there's almost something in that in the character too, and that's one. And he didn't want to give him yet another thing to disapprove of. It's like one thing if I killed somebody, but I'm not going to tell you I had sex with him.
One of the most interesting things to me, though, about Wilder's work as a whole is the way that he explored masculinity. He just had a really interesting view on masculinity. It was very flawed. It was almost counter to that classic American hero. He would get these protagonists and he would put them in very desperate situations and see how far he could push them. He would show men as weak and cowardly and manipulative and as liars at various points, more extremes, things like Ace in the Hole, which is like more extreme. You get someone like Kirk Douglas, who's just totally cutthroat, or The Apartment, where Jack Lemmon's just trying to get ahead. And across the board in his films, there's a huge emphasis on men, masculinity, their relationships between each other. Even things like The 7-Year Itch, which you think is one man's fantasy about Marilyn Monroe, a lot of the background of that are his male peers and colleagues talking about their extramarital affairs and all the banter. And I just find it fascinating. I find it a really fascinating thing about Wilder's work.
Well, and I don't think that you get a more femme fatale than you do in Phyllis Dietrichsen. I mean, she is just wonderful when it comes to that. And the other thing, too, talking about the kind of unreliable narrator, we see a lot of things happen with Phyllis that Walter wouldn't necessarily be privy to, like her having a gun under the couch cushion, or, to me, what's even better is her reaction to Walter killing her husband. And just that look on her face that we don't
smile. It's just
her
so
eyes
good.
are dancing in that. I love it.
It is so good. She just looks so evil. It's just amazing. I mean, Barbara Stanwyk, was really great in Ball of Fire, wasn't she? Which was scripted by Wilder and Brackett, so you can see why she'd totally be right for Philip, even though the Sugar Puss O'Shea in Ball of Fire has got a bit of a heart, so she's not as mean. You know, you can totally see the prototype there, so why she would be good for that role. But the things that Wilder makes her do is Phyllis. It's just so completely unsympathetic and nasty and rotten, and she's glorious because of it.
I do want to talk a little bit more about that dialogue because it really gets me, well, right from the beginning, right as soon as he opens his mouth, and the way that he describes himself in that voiceover that he has to give, you know, his name, his birth date, the date that this is happening on, his marital status, all this stuff. And basically he's now putting himself into an actuarial table by giving all of this information. And it's really nice. And then when we move into the story and we have him critiquing Phyllis's house right off the bat when he's coming to this Spanish place that probably cost $30,000, which made me laugh. Probably cost $30,000 and they're still paying for it. And those terrific double entendres of her up at the top of the staircase with the towel on. And of course, I'm thinking of Fletch at that moment.
Can I borrow your towel for a sec? My car just hit a water buffalo.
Her with the towel on and him saying like,
How do you do, Mrs. Dietrichsen? I'm Walter Neff, Pacific All Risk.
Pacific All what?
The Pacific All Risk Insurance Company. It's about some renewals on the automobiles. I've been trying to contact your husband for the past 2 weeks, but he's never in his office.
Is there anything I can do?
The insurance ran out on the 15th. I'd hate to think of you having a smashed fender or something while you're not fully covered.
Perhaps I know what you mean, Mr. Neff. I've just been taking a sunbath.
No pigeons around, I hope.
The back and forth between them. Oh my, the back and forth about her anklet, and especially when she talks about how he is trying too hard and that there's a speed limit in this state.
There's a speed limit in this state, Mr. Neff. 45 miles an hour.
How fast was I going, officer?
I'd say around 90.
Suppose you get down off your motorcycle and give me a ticket.
Suppose I let you off with a warning this time.
Suppose it doesn't take.
Suppose I have to whack you over the knuckles.
Suppose I bust out crying and put my head on your shoulder.
Suppose you try putting it on my husband's shoulder.
That tears it. 8:30 tomorrow evening, then.
That's what I suggested.
Will you be here, too?
I guess so. I usually am.
Same chair, same perfume, same anklet?
I wonder if I know what you mean.
I wonder if you wonder.
As much as it's great writing, it's also the way it's acted and directed, because we've all seen that kind of dialogue not work. And even, you know, and stuff I know we'll get to later, but some of the remake stuff, they use some of the same dialogue, and it's easy to see how terribly it can crash and burn.
Yes.
if it's not done right.
Those little things like, you know, oh, my name's Walter Neff with 2 F's, like the story. And she's like, what story? The Philadelphia story. I mean, just that back and forth. It just moves so quickly. And you're right. The performances just elevate that. So it doesn't sound, because, yeah, you put that in the mouth of somebody wrong and it's just going to sound so damn clunky. But they just elevate it to sound almost like poetry.
And part of what makes the film so amazing is that, again, it doesn't feel like the film is doing a style to do a style. It feels like it's kind of part of what it's saying about the people. So whether it's the cinematography or the writing, it's like in every line that they're delivering, you never feel like it's about somebody's clever line. It still feels like part of a seduction, or it's something a character's actually doing. Like they're talking like that for a reason. And I think a lot of later films just became about the clever dialogue, especially in the noir world. This isn't about the poetry. I mean, it's like when Shakespeare's at his most enjoyable when you're watching people honestly going after human things using the poetry. And I feel like that's what these characters are doing here. And that's what Wilder, the director, didn't fall into the trap of Wilder, the writer, making it about those lines. Those lines are really smart things to say when you're sort of doing this dance that these people are doing of possible seduction, sizing each other up. So they feel grounded. And I think that's why it plays so well. And I think if it didn't feel like they were trying to do something, it would become, just arch really fast.
I know Chandler was brought in because of his capability for dialogue. But the dialogue, again, across the board in Wilder's, even his writing, his screenplays, is always amazing. And I agree with you, Keith. It's not just for cleverness' sake. There's so much more going on in his dialogue. Even those pre-codes that he did, things like Midnight for Mitchell Lyson or Bluebeard's Eighth Wife, as you did with Brackett, because Wilder was obsessed with American dialogue, because obviously he came here, fled Berlin, and he would listen to how people spoke, and he was really taken with it. So he studied it, but he would always get in a partner to help him write it. And across the board, you get just these fucking amazing lines. There's one in Foreign Affair that I love, where Marlene Dietrich comes along and she looks at Jean Arthur and says, "I see you don't believe in lipstick." It's just like, oh. You know, so Chandler's dialogue is fucking amazing, but I think it's something that's integral to Wilder. There's this so much innuendo, so much in the subtext of what people say is always a purpose, but this very veiled way of speaking as well. As a writer, I just love that. I think it's magnificent, but it is very human as well. And then it gets around the whole code thing. They can be in your face talking about fucking, but not actually saying it. And the whole subversion of that I love as well, because they're doing it up front and centre, and it's like the biggest fuck you to Breen in the code office, really. It's just so good.
You mean they're doing it straight down the line?
When Fred MacMurray goes, "Do you want me to run the vacuum cleaner around?" It's just stuff like that. It's just like, oh, it's so cheeky.
And I know that there was talk about how the dialogue in Cain's work didn't work coming out of people's mouths, that it just sounded flat.
I don't like the dialogue, and I'm probably going to get shot by pulp novel fans. And it was the first time I'd actually read the text. Like, seen the film so many times, but never actually got round to reading the text. I haven't got round to reading Postman or Mildred Pierce, even though I love the film versions. So I'm a bad person, really. But the dialogue is just so like I said to Mike before we record, I cannot believe he meets this woman and then suddenly decides to kill her husband, and there's literally no tension in there. Their dialogue's just so practical. It's just like, "Do you want insurance?" "Well, I don't know." It's just like, what? This is, can you imagine if the film had that in it?
Well, it is interesting to me, though, how much of the story makes it into the film.
Yeah, the stretch is there. The stretch is great. It's the dialogue that I didn't... Well, obviously I'm used to Double Indemnity's dialogue, so it came as a bit of a shock that it was pedestrian, I guess.
There are some passages that are directly lifted, though, which I thought was nice, like the whole thing about Keyes not trusting the calendar. And it's almost there. It's close, but they definitely gave it a nice polish when they brought it into the screenplay.
Walter, I've had 26 years of this, and let me tell you, I'm getting...
Yeah, and you loved every minute of it, Keyes. You love it, only you worry about it too darn much. You and your little man. You're so darn conscientious, you're driving yourself crazy. You wouldn't even say today's Tuesday unless you looked at the calendar. Then you check to see if it was this year's or last year's calendar. Then you find out who printed the calendar and find out if their calendar checked with the World Almanac's calendar.
Now, that's enough from you, Walter. Now, get out of here before I throw my desk at you.
When I got back to the office, I found Keyes had been looking for me. Keyes is head of the claim department and the most tiresome man to do business with in the whole world. You can't even say today is Tuesday without he has to look on the calendar, and then check if it's this year's calendar or last year's calendar, and then find out what company printed the calendar, and then find out if their calendar checks with the World Almanac calendar.
But there are bits where I was just like, oh, okay, this is right from there. Though there's a certain point in the movie where they just took the Cain story and just threw it out, and we're like, yeah, no, we're going from here. We're going to do a whole different thing. Thank God, because I know you might get some shit from some Cain purists, but I think Cain himself even thought that they did a better job with his story than he did, because the end of the Cain story just goes frickin' bonkers. It's crazier than when we talked about The Getaway and how nuts the Jim Thompson story gets after a certain point. I mean, because we are talking about Phyllis being in love with death and painting herself up so her face is white and putting herself in red velvet, and them escaping on a boat and her wanting to dive off the boat with Walter so that they can be eaten by sharks. It's like, where are we going with this? And her being this...
Can we mention the fact she's a child killer as well?
Oh yeah, she's an angel of death in this in the story. It's wild. It's not the I killed the first Mrs. Dietrichsen so that I could get with this oil tycoon who's now his fortune is going down, so now I want to kill him and get the money. There's not just one body in her background. There are many bodies, and yeah, killing people just to kill them, basically.
It's insane. I'm so glad they cleaned it up and just focused on that one thing, because you've got all this background story coming out. You've got a relationship with Lola, as she's saying all this stuff, and the ex-boyfriend, all that weird double crossing and cars. And I was just reading it and I was just like, what the hell is going on now? Where the hell is this going? We've suddenly shit the bed in Act 3. It was, I'm probably going to get stoned to death now by Cain fans. I'm not taking any of that back.
Well, it's also just that it's such different media. I mean, there's in a number of sort of the dark, like Jim Thompson does it all. I mean, there's a lot of those writers were drawn to things that were more aggressively surreal and insane, and they kind of, I think, work on paper. They don't always, I think that's part of the translation to film that they grounded, that ultimately the film is so much more grounded in human reality. But there is a number of these writers you do get to the third act and it's like, oh my God, they literally took acid and started going off, which I feel like, there's also, I'd be interested to see some noir films that use some of that. But I thought that for this, the whole difference of what made it work for an audience for 70, 80 years now is that it all becomes humanized.
Yeah, it's much better. I did actually find a news report from 44, actually, August, where James Cain came out in the press and just said how well director had done. He said he really loved the version, and he was more annoyed at the Hayes office because he'd been in there'd been a bidding war 8 years previously, and he was being offered 25 grand. And then all of a sudden the deals were off because the Hayes Code Office had forbidden the filming of the book on the grounds that it constituted a blueprint for murder. Going by what happens in the book. Wilder's maybe. So when Paramount finally bought it, he only got 15 grand and he was really pissed about this. But he loved what Wilder did with it. There was a really interesting comment at the end of the article that he said he was involved with Metro doing a screenplay for a film for Billy Wilder again called Frankie from Frisco, which I could only find one reference to in a book somewhere that it seems like there was only a treatment ever written. It was set in the 1800s and Arthur Hornblower Jr. basically just kicked it out. So I don't know. It's like one of those weird projects. Billy Wilder doing period as well. Interesting. I want to know more about it.
March 22nd, 1946, Metro shelves Frankie from Frisco because the subject matter was too tough to lick, Hedda Hopper says. Based on James M. Cain's story with a screenplay by Robert D. Andrews, Frankie from Frisco was set in 1865 and dealt with building railroads. It was to star Lana Turner, the Times said.
Then, at this point, Cain was selling his rights for the Postman Always Rings Twice, Mildred Pierce, which is just, I love Mildred Pierce, another incredible film adaptation. Haven't read the book. Someone said to me once, you should read the book, but it's quite different. So having read this one, I have to think, how different.
You talked about how there are moments that ground this in reality, and those are some of the most interesting bits for me are things like Walter Neff going bowling and going to the drive-in or drive-through, or when they're at the market and we've got the the woman that interrupts them talking and she's wants something that's on a higher shelf. It's like those moments, especially the woman in the grocery store, they add this nice tension and this nice sense of reality that we wouldn't necessarily get if it was always just Walter and Phyllis, occasionally Walter and Keyes. But we've got these other characters and these other moments that really kind of put us into a real Los Angeles. And that's the other thing I like about this too, is just how much they use California and Los Angeles, and that they use real street names and talk about how they're going to the corner of this and that.
So much was shot on location, which was quite rare. Like, Wilder hated shooting on location as well, just because you couldn't control. And they had to have the police out helping them, controlling all the people standing by watching and causing a bit of a spectacle. So it shows so many of these locations from Hollywood. It's great. It's like Sunset Boulevard as well. You just get to see these places that no longer exist, like a little snapshot in history.
Which I'm wondering if some of that might have come from like shortages during the war. I mean, I don't know if this holds any water.
No, I have another press clipping actually. So basically, the War Production Board had put a $5,000 limit on new materials for sets. Basically, they'd gone out and they just had to find all the locations because they couldn't afford to build them, which caused apparently at one point the scene in the garage, because that was on location, the store was on location, it was an actual real store just up the road from Paramount. They had the drive-in restaurant was a location. They had Burbank Railway Station. Like, they used so many in the house as well. But they had the bit in the garage. The comic Fred Allen had apparently sauntered through and got into his car. They shot the scene where he comes in and leaves his car with a valet. Didn't notice him till the rushes. It's just in the background. So, and it says in this thing, Billy Wilder said at one point we planned the camera to take in the whole garage. Nobody noticed Fred Allen had come out of a door and walked into his automobile. And later when we saw the rushes at the studio, Fred MacMurray let out a yip and had the projectionist run that part of the film over again. And sure enough, there was Allen, large as life, patiently waiting for the scene to end so that the sound of his starter wouldn't be recorded. Which I think is great.
Well, and of course, that amazing shot of the Hollywood Bowl, I mean, that definitely was shot on location, right? That always strikes me. I'm just like, oh, wow, they're really pushing it here. But, okay, I'll let it pass.
On the other side, what's a really cool, and I think that was where, I assume it was a set, was the office itself. And there's a really amazing transition that nobody ever seems to notice, but when Fred MacMurray comes in from the outside and he comes in from this real world, and one of the things I think works so well in the film, and whether it was intentional or just the luck of the way things were, that they were forced into doing a lot of location stuff around the edges because of the war situation. But to me, the tension between this kind of the set world, which doesn't feel real in the same way, and the dreamlike quality of some of the scenes with just the main characters, and then there's the outside world out there that's kind of separate from the world that they're existing in, their own kind of weird, strange little psychotic twosome, and even threesome with Keyes. I just feel like that strain works really well for the film. But when Fred MacMurray comes in from the outside, he goes into the elevator, and I believe if you look at that, there's a false wall outside the elevator. The elevator door closes and it's an elevator set. And then it opens and it reveals that incredible office set. And the camera comes out and enters, and it's like he's now gone from the real world into, what could arguably be said to be sort of inside his head a little bit. And I'm pretty sure watching it again that it's just all a trick of the camera. I mean, it's basically a false wall was put outside the elevator set. The elevator door closes, it opens, and the much larger set they built was back behind it.
From what I've read, that interior of the insurance office was based on some of the offices at Paramount. So it would have been like all the secretaries and stuff working with all those desks. Because I love that shot later on when you have all of the people there. And it just seems like this total hive of activity.
It's almost like a little blueprint for what he did with the apartment then. Because I love the sets in the apartment. just the whole office thing where you see those desks going on for miles. There's a shot in Double Indemnity that's similar, just not as big and not as artificial. But, you know, all that little hubbub of women on their typewriters and stuff.
I like that you brought up this whole idea of how quickly Neff, or in the book Huff, how quickly he turns and agrees to go ahead and do this plot with Phyllis Nerdlinger.
I prefer Dietrichsen. It's like...
Which I always wonder if there's a nod to Marlene Dietrich.
It has to be, because Marlene is one of the biggest femme fatales, isn't she? She was good friends with Wilder, and obviously he'd go on to work with her in Foreign Affair and then witness for the prosecution, but they knew each other from Berlin, and she is the archetype really of one of the best femme fatales ever in cinema. Those roles that she did for von Sternberg way before the noir must have had a bearing on this, although Marlene always looked really classy, whereas Phyllis looks awful.
Yeah, Phyllis is definitely not classy. I mean, we can talk about the wig, but the whole thing of like the anklet and the perfume that she got in Ensenada, which is supposed to be a really cheapy tourist town, the way that she'll drink bourbon with Walter, not from the bottle, but she will drink bourbon with him, and that she seems like, you know, and she comes from a lower class background, but she's definitely tried to elevate herself as this wife of this failing oil baron. You were saying the whole idea of like him immediately turning. I like that there isn't necessarily that quickness in this movie, that we have several meetings. We've got the first meeting of these two, him coming back, her kind of introducing this idea, her going over to his apartment. And then I think that's where they kind of, quote unquote, seal the deal. And I also like, too, talking about this idea of us leaving the story to go back to him at the office and then coming back to where the story is and omitting that possible sex scene. I love the way that the camera will push in and pull out to kind of introduce where these scenes are. And especially that we just seem to get closer and closer on Neff as he's telling the story, and the way that Fred MacMurray looks in that voiceover section where he just is so sweaty, and that the blood stain on his jacket is getting bigger every single time we come back. It's just those nice little touches of just that he's not necessarily afraid to look really bad, because Walter's in a really bad position here.
How sweaty and beat up MacMurray looks is really kind of, again, very much ahead of its time. I mean, he looks very real in his distress, and the underplaying, which, the fact that he's in pain, but he's pushing his way through it, and the way the blood stain just slowly grows, and all that stuff is really cool. And it's not something you saw a lot in movies. That the star would be, first of all, the star looks terrible, and then he's also announcing literally at the very beginning of the film, "I'm the killer," which is one of the great sort of climactic moments. I think the structure that most people would have been used to in terms of an audience is like, this is going to be a story about, who did what. And here the film immediately, like 2 minutes in, he goes, I'll let you in on a big secret, I'm the killer. And that's a really interesting thing to do, because it takes the rug out. I mean, again, now we've got that. Now that's a kind of structure that's not uncommon. But I think at the time, for a mainstream audience, it probably was pretty, it was probably no less surprising when Hitchcock kills off Janice Lee at the beginning of Psycho. I mean, it's got to have been very odd that here's our main character hero, and he's sitting here going, I'm a killer. And now you're going to watch the whole story through that lens.
Especially someone like Fred MacMurray as well. I always wondered, I know they wanted George Raft, which I can't really see. George Raft, bless him. And Fred MacMurray finally got the role. It seems like a weird sort of irony when you think about Billy Wilder and Mitchell Leisen. Because Billy Wilder and Charles Brackett often did scripts, or they did a few scripts for Mitchell Leisen, but it was Leisen's cutting of Wilder's dialogue from Hold Back the Dawn, some key dialogue that he really wanted in there that made Wilder say, fuck this, I'm going to go and direct my own films. And MacMurray was one of Leisen's stars. He was in these wonderful, I love those comedies with people like Carol Lombard, for example, like Hands Across the Table and Swing High, Swing Low. This very easygoing, very cheeky sort of guy. And then MacMurray, who is Lyson's star, ends up being completely reinvented by Wilder. So it seems like a strange cosmic irony there. But then he does the same thing with Ray Milland in A Lost Weekend, because Ray Milland was also one of Mitchell Lyson's players, or Paramount player, but Mitchell Lyson always claimed, Ray Milland's rising star as his, because Ray Milland, again, was appearing in these very, very lovely kind of comedies. And prior to this, my mind has gone blank. Remember the Night, that was it. Yeah, prior to this, Barbara Stanwyk and Fred MacMurray had been in this very lovely sort of Christmas comedy, Remember the Night, where Barbara Stanwyk is a shoplifter and Fred MacMurray is the prosecutor, and it's just before Christmas and he gets her a fine. But he feels sorry for her, so he takes her to his parents. And so that's what they were before they turn up in Double Indemnity, and then here they are. Fred MacMurray sweating and bleeding everywhere. Barbara Stanwyk in a wig and an ankle bracelet, and it just breaks all the rules. And I would have loved to have known, being in the audience at the time, to just see how people reacted to that.
And ultimately, I think it's part of why the film is so great. I mean, I think if you'd cast a George Raft, or even if you'd cast an actor maybe who's a better actor but was always the tough guy, always the guy on the edge, I just don't know that you would have related to the character the same way. Part of what makes the film so fascinating is the edge that MacMurray walks, under Wilder's direction, and where he's awful, but he's also a regular guy. You can empathize and identify with him in spite of yourself. And I think if they cast somebody who's like, I'm tougher than you, I was a hard-boiled guy before this, I just don't know that you would have had the same emotional reaction to the movie. It would have just been a story of a bad man instead of a story of a bad man that you see yourself in much more than you'd like to.
Because you have to or part of you has to like Walter Neff for it to work. It just wouldn't work, if it was some kind of smugger, more actor with more bravado, like you said, like a hard man. I don't think it would have had that vulnerable edge. I think Wilder's men were often very vulnerable, which is another thing that went against the grain for the Hollywood formula. Very vulnerable, very weak, and you need to believe that Neff is weak. He thinks he's in charge of everything, but he's not. The minute he meets Barbara Stanwyk, he's fucked. And we know that because he's weak and he's likable and he's not really a bad person. He's just something about him that just gets carried away. But we have to believe that. Otherwise, it wouldn't have the resonance. That last scene wouldn't have the potency that it has.
Well, we have to think that he's weak when we see him. I mean, we don't necessarily see him, but the figure at the very beginning in the opening credits who's on the crutches. Ostensibly, that's MacMurray, even though it's probably not. It's probably somebody else, but someone who is injured and is without the use of one of their legs. And then the next time we see MacMurray, he's shot. And so you're right, he's completely portrayed as being weak right off the bat. And then we finally get him fully intact after that once he begins the story. But to your point, too, we have to like him, and we really have to dislike some of the other people in the story, like Mr. Dietrichsen. And he is just a jerk right off the bat. And then there's always the line that strikes me funny when, and I guess that was a pun, when Phyllis says that he will get drunk, Dietrichsen will get drunk and slap her around. And I always wonder if he actually does, or if that's just her trying to pull those strings on Walter and her trying to be the damsel in distress.
Because when you meet him, it's like the daughter's scared of him, for a start. She lies to him. And you see Dietrichsen, or Phyllis, saying, he slaps me around, you think, she's just playing him. She's doing that typical thing that we've seen so many times after this, where the woman will say, oh, you know, this guy's a bully. But then you see the husband and you think maybe she is telling the truth because he's horrible. He's not a nice person. You don't feel sorry for him being killed whatsoever because all his lines are shouted for a start. He just, when he goes on about her for buying too many hats.
I suppose you realize, Mr. Dietrichsen, that not being an employee, you are not covered by the State Compensation Insurance Act. The only way you can protect yourself is by having a personal policy of your own.
Yeah, I know all about that. The next thing you'll tell me I need earthquake insurance and lightning insurance and hail insurance.
If we bought all the insurance they could think of, we'd stay broke paying for it, wouldn't we, honey?
What keeps us broke is you going out and buying 5 hats at a crack. Who needs a hat in California?
You know, he humiliates his wife. He treats his daughter like property. So you don't, you know, when he goes, you just think, tough. You don't really feel for him.
Though, to be fair, she's out seeing that Nino Zacchetti guy, who eventually ends up starting to bang her and her mother, which is just crazy.
Well, Nino seems like the dad as well, doesn't he? He seems like and I don't, because he's not like this in the book. When Neff drops her off and meets Nino, he's shouting like the dad and barking these and you think she's going from the frying pan to the fire here.
This is Mr. Neff, Nino.
Hello, Nino.
The name is Zacchetti.
Nino, please. Mr. Neff gave me a ride from the house. I told him all about us.
Why does he have to get told about us?
We don't have to worry about Mr. Neff, Nino.
I'm not doing any worrying. Just don't you broadcast so much.
What's the matter with you, Nino? Well, he's a friend.
I don't have any friends. If I did, I'd like to pick them myself. Come on.
Look, Sonny, she needed a ride, so I brought her along. Is that anything to get tough about?
All right, Lola, make up your mind. Are you coming or aren't you?
Of course I'm coming.
And it must have been intentional because he's not like that in the book at all. But then the husband is nicer in the book as well.
I can't buy that Nino Zacchetti of the movie is a medical student.
He doesn't look anything like it, does he?
Nino Zacchetti, I mean, I could not think of a more ethnic name if I tried, and it seems like the guy who sets his own truck on fire, who's got the thicker accent, it seems like he could play Nino Zacchetti almost better because Nino is just, he's a tough guy. He seems like he could have come out of George Raff's, trailer or something. It just feels like he is that tough guy, and it's like, you're a medical student, you've captured Lola's heart. When Neff kind of saves him at the end of the film and sends him back with Lola, I'm just like, well, that's kind of nice what you're doing, Walter, but I would really rather that Lola didn't have Nino Zacchetti in her life.
Yeah, I absolutely assumed the medical student thing was a story he told her. I just assumed that it was like, that he's just playing her, that the way that Barbara Stanwyk's playing Neff is, I assume like the guy lost his money. He's like, oh yeah, I was a medical student. It's like one of the things you say to impress a young girl, and he's just, and that became the excuse for, well, I lost all my money, but I was a medical student. And, there's a whole story there that I think you could it's probably its own little echo of the main story.
And I like these things, speaking of echoes, these echoes of like Lola hiding in the car, which is what Neff will do later on when he commits the murder, or the way that the murder is committed of him hiding in the back of the car and coming up and, strangling her husband, which is somewhat similar to, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't think I've actually sat through this entire movie. I've just seen a couple stills and previews. It's very similar to Postman Rings Twice, if memory serves.
Are we allowed to say that? Because it's just in case anyone hasn't seen it.
I mean, that's the thing I remember from, my first film book.
It's the same thing. It's the same fucking thing. It's like an insurance policy and a lever, and it's a very similar story.
Can we talk about Porter Hall for a few minutes? Mr. Jackson from Medford, Oregon. Oh my God. I love this character. The guy who almost undoes everything for them.
He's great.
Oh, we talked about Porter Hall a long time ago on the show because there's a character in Beyond the Valley of the Dolls who's named Porter Hall. And so when I see the real Porter Hall, I always have to laugh a little bit. But my goodness, him just being this overly effusive guy on the train and talking about going up to Medford, and then when he shows back up again later at Keyes' office, and just the way that he's trying to put Walter into context. I love that. That is so wonderful. And just, I'm on the edge of my seat with that character.
He's such a colourful little character as well, isn't he? He's like, as soon as he turns up on the train, like a bit of a busybody, and he's nosy, and he wants to... everyone's met someone like that when you're out travelling, and there's, oh, for fuck's sake, you know, there's someone who's like, oh, where are you going? And you just, as soon as you see him there, you just think, oh, God, but he's great. He's absolutely brilliant. Even though he's probably only on screen for about a whole minute.
Well, and even the way that he's trying to scam the insurance company with that expense account, and that he wants to stop at that, when was it, an obstetrician or an osteoporosis doctor or whatever. It's just like, okay, this is interesting. But, I mean, there are so many people in this movie that are just inherently not good, or that have bad qualities. You know, the boss at the insurance agency, I love that scene too, when he's trying to figure out what happened with this Dietrichsen case, and that Keyes puts him in his place. And especially when Keyes has no time for this guy, because he was born and raised in the insurance business, but he was born and raised in the front office. He's the previous owner's father. So he's inherited this company, and Keyes just has no time for this guy whatsoever.
That speech he gives about the probability, and apparently just did that in one take, is incredible. He just spits out this whole bunch of how people die by suicide. And it's just like, without even taking a breath, and totally unravels the guy's thesis, even though the guy's actually right.
I think I know. In fact, I know what happened to Dietrichsen.
You know what?
I know it was not an accident. What do you say to that?
Well, you got the ball. Let's see you run with it.
There's a widespread feeling that just because a man has a large office, he must be an idiot.
Mr. Norton, first thing that struck me was that suicide angle. Only I dumped it into the wastepaper basket just 3 seconds later. You know, you ought to take a look at the statistics on suicide sometime. You might learn a little something about the insurance business.
Mr. Keyes, I was raised in the insurance business.
Yeah, in the front office. Come now, you've never read an actuarial table in your life, have you? Why, we've got 10 volumes on suicide alone. Suicide by race, by color, by occupation, by sex, by seasons of the year, by time of day. Suicide, how committed? By poisons, by firearms, by drowning, by leaks. Suicide by poison, subdivided by types of poison, such as corrosive, irritant, systemic, gaseous, narcotic, alkaloid, protein, and so forth. Suicide by leaps, subdivided by leaps from high places, under the wheels of trains, under the wheels of trucks, under the feet of horses, from steamboats. But Mr. Norton, of all the cases on record, there's not one single case of suicide by leap from the rear end of a moving train. And you know how fast that train was going at the point where the body was found? 15 miles an hour. Now, how can anybody jump off a slow-moving train like that with any kind of expectation that he would kill himself? No soap, Mr. Norton. We're sunk, and we'll have to pay through the nose, and you know it.
I like how the guy's such a dick to Keyes because he's not wearing a suit coat. You know, oh, is it a particularly warm day today, Mr. Keyes?
Oh, yeah. Talking to people annoying each other, though, we have to talk about Chandler and Wilder. Because those two together, wasn't there some gripe that Billy Wilder was wearing his hat in the office and Raymond Chandler couldn't cope with it? I know he couldn't handle him opening the window or walking around or just basically doing anything. And those two locked in a room, to have been a fly on the wall there. Through all that conflict, though, they somehow come up with this incredible script.
Yeah, apparently Chandler liked to smoke, but always kept the windows closed. And Wilder he was a pacer, which drove Chandler nuts. And he had
and he'd open the window.
Yeah, and he had a cane, and he would wave the cane underneath Chandler's nose or something. And there was a huge inter-office memos going back and forth. But I guess out of great conflict comes some brilliant work.
And then, of course, Wilder went on and did Lost Weekend, which was his ode to Raymond Chandler about an failed alcoholic writer having a breakdown. Which is a fabulous film, but inspired by Chandler, who was a bit of an alkie.
Yeah, I heard different things about whether it was Wilder who would go to the bathroom and come back, and Chandler had obviously been having a nip, or that it was vice versa, that Chandler would go to the bathroom and hit his flask and then come back and be in a better mood. But that was kind of sweet revenge that Wilder got on him by crafting that film. I mean, we could go through every single little thing in here, but it just, everything, like I said, this is like, it's like clockwork. And actually, speaking of clockwork, and this wasn't a bad segue, there are even moments that remind me of one of my other favorite film noirs, which is The Big Clock, and this whole idea of Walter being right there when Keyes finally comes around to that position that his boss had. And it's just like, there's another man here. We're going to find him, Walter. And that he's right there next to him. And also talking about that thing with Porter Hall, I like the way that Wilder flips the framing of it so that it's Neff in the background and Porter Hall in the foreground versus the train where it was vice versa. And it's just such a nice echo there of the two men, and how, I like how Neff is keeping his back to Hall, and this time he's staying behind his back. He doesn't want to be seen again, but doing it in a different way. Just such nice little touches. I mean, again, Wilder, despite what some people say, was a great director, and he knew what the hell he was doing.
Briefly, one of the things that I love about the film, and I think that holds up so well, and the Neff and the scenes with the Porter Hall character are such great examples of it, is Wilder's knowledge of how far to push something and not to go past it. I feel like the modern version of the scene on the back of the train would have dragged on and on, and it would have been, oh, now there's another way he's going to screw up the plot. There's another way he's going to screw up the plot. And throughout this film, whether it's the dialogue about the speeding ticket, whether it's both of the scenes with Porter Hall, they go on just the right amount of time to create maximum suspense and before it crosses into feeling like you're being manipulated by the film. And I feel like that's an art that's been lost since then. I mean, you look at any of these things where the car won't start, whatever. It just seems like the timing is brilliant in this film, and it would be so easy to go a beat longer and kind of go, oh, we got it already. And it's sort of, I feel like I wish filmmakers would study it now, because I think this is the perfect lesson in how long you can play something out.
The scene with Porter Hall when they're on the train kind of reminds me of a scene from a movie that I know you're familiar with, Keith, which is The Killing. It kind of reminds me of when the Timothy Carey character is at the racetrack and the black guy is being so nice to him to the point where he finally has to be really nasty to get him to leave him alone.
I love that scene. It's so mean as well, because he has to be really, starts off really nice, and then it's kind of like, this guy's like, hey, and then he's just like, will this guy not go already? And he's, it's definitely.
It's interesting, too, that there are very, very few characters, ethnic characters in this film. I mean, there's I guess he's Greek, the guy who tries to burn up his own truck, and that when he's leaving the office, he actually thanks Keyes, which I found to be fantastic, that he's basically like, thank you, Keyes, for putting me back on the straight and narrow. He talks about, like, a woman that comes in to clean his house. Neff has a woman that comes in to clean his house once a week, which I don't know if that's just a joke or not. But there's the African-American guy who's working in the garage that we were talking about earlier, and that he uses that guy as an alibi. And then he also uses the guy who shares his office, whose last name is Schwartz, which I found very interesting too, that here's this, this Jewish guy, or at least I would assume by the name that this guy is Jewish. So he's using these people of other ethnicities as his alibis, which I found kind of interesting. The guy that plays Schwartz, as soon as I saw him, I was just like, oh my God, I've seen this guy so many times before. I think he's on screen for like 10 seconds, but I mostly know him for playing one of the characters in The Thing, the original The Thing, because he's got a much bigger role in that one. Douglas Spencer is the guy's name.
That's what I love about the studio era, though. You had all these little contract players, little bit part players, and you tend to see these faces show. You might not necessarily know who the person is, and then you look them up and they're like, man in elevator, but they become so much part of the fabric of that period of cinema that they feel like old friends when they pop up. Nobody knows anything about them or little things. I know there's some crazy people who go out and research people's backgrounds to help, but there's always that one person, did you know? But yeah, they fascinate me because they were just on a salary and they just get called out. Well, you can be the office assistant, or next week you're going to be the guy at the diner. And it was just a job to them. They weren't really stars, but they held together that whole fabric of of the studios.
I didn't realize just how right that boss is. Watching the movie, I'm like, okay, yeah, he's right. And which is funny that Keyes is still arguing that he's wrong. But then later when we hear Keyes on the dictaphone and him actually saying, I don't agree with you. We should not be tailing Walter Neff. He's a stand-up guy, and I've been with him all these years. And it's just like, again, had you been doing that, had you seen him out with Lola all of those times, you might have started to suspect something. But nope, Keyes is still very much on his side. And I know it's cheesy as hell, but it just works so well for me, is the whole thing with the cigarette and the lighter, and just how every time Keyes goes to light his cigar, that he's always searching his pockets and can never find it, and that Fred MacMurray, Walter Neff, just lights up a match off of his thumb and has it right there for Keyes, and the way that is echoed at the very end of the film is just so nice. And I used to, because they used to do that in films all the time. They would have matches, and they would like with Klaus Kinski's face, and for a few dollars more, take the match and scratch it across his face and light it up. I didn't realize that they changed the way that matches were made over, the last, 40 years or so, that they have safety matches that don't light as easily, because man, I used to try to do that all the time when I was a kid. Just let's light this match by scratching across brick or this or that. And never worked for me, goddammit.
The whole betrayal of Keyes, though, is the thing that really gives it that punch at the end, rather than the betrayal of Dietrichsen, because that always seems inevitable. From the minute we see her, we know that she's not quite right. But with Keyes, when he realises, he's been played, that is the heartbreaker.
I do think it's the only real love relationship in the movie. I mean, whatever's going on with Stanwyk's character, the real love, and it's explicit. The fact is that, for a movie in the time, you had these two guys that, that he says, I love you too. And yes, he's being sarcastic, but he even says in the voiceover, but I really meant it. That is the betrayal. That is the heart of the film, and that's what's so interesting, is that you've got the heart and the brain ripped apart. But really, the only true love in the movie is between those two guys.
And I know some critics have taken that and tried to play it into this whole homoerotic relationship and stuff, and you can do that, but it's just for me, there can be platonic love between two male characters, though the one is definitely
absolutely.
Oh, and to me, it almost feels father and son.
It does.
To me, it feels, it's that kind of love, but it is true love. It is true. You really know that Keyes is heartbroken into this film in a way that the Stanwyk character could never be. It's just not part of who she is.
No, and I think that's the thing that another thing that goes against the grain of Hollywood is, you're not supposed to show men in love, not as friends, not that way. Which is why I think people try to read it as something else. But like I said with Wilder, masculinity is a very complex thing, as it should be. And he showed all these different areas, in the way that men are forced into certain situations or they become desperate. And it did a lot on the male ego. Look at Sunset Boulevard. That's all about male ego and weakness and vulnerability. So, I don't think, because Billy Wilder's films were always, when he used sex, it was more about power and about other things, about opening up these male identities than just being sex. His films were never, what's the word for it? I guess they were never really sexy. I think, there's loads of sex in a lot of his films in the context, in the subtext of the things people say, but there's always this pushing and shoving, and it's all about power and games people play and manipulation. But he wasn't somebody who particularly cared that much about sex just as a sensational aspect. Even in something like Kiss Me Stupid, which drove the censors absolutely mad, audiences thought it was disgusting because it's about wife swapping and prostitution, wasn't really about that. It was about this failed songwriter and his own ego. So I think it's always a lot more complex in Wilder, and it's easy to say, oh, they loved each other. Well, they did, but it wasn't necessarily a gay thing.
Yeah, the scene where he offers Walter the new position, and that it's so hard for him to not insult Walter. Like, they've got that banter, and the way that when Walter turns him down, and he's like, "Oh, you're not smarter, you're just taller." And it's like, oh, it's so nice. And yeah, you're right. It is much more of a filial thing. And that his son, his adopted son, betrays him. It is heartbreaking.
Well, he's been his mentor, hasn't he? Obviously, he's been in the business so long, Keyes, and Neff is like the young talent who's been there for 11 years or whatever, and he's learned everything he knows from this older man. It's definitely more like a father and son, because Neff hasn't really got any family that you see. So there's a lot of really interesting subtext in there, but it's a different kind of love. I think you need that because he needs to be anchored to something. There needs to be a loss at the end. If you just lost Dietrichsen, she's not really anything to lose, is she? There has to be something else that punch to the gut.
Well, and I think the fact that Keyes sees all that he does in Walter Neff helps us as an audience also, again, go, yeah, there's a good man somewhere in there.
Yeah.
Keyes is someone that we trust, and he is like a father figure to Neff, but he's also like a father figure for the audience, and he's somebody whose little man is always right, and he's always liked Walter. So obviously on some level, he helps us go like, yeah, Walter's not inherently completely bad. And I think Keyes does really is an important counterweight for that emotional reason too.
Well, yeah, there is that push and pull between Dietrichsen and Keyes. Then there's that incredible shot of Phyllis hiding behind the door when Keyes is leaving. Talk about amazing framing. I love that. That is so nice. And it is almost like devil and angel on his shoulders at that point. I have a hard time believing that there was 18 more minutes of footage to this film, this whole ending that has been talked about forever. I'm wondering if it was 18 minutes as like an assembly cut or something. I can't imagine this movie going on for 18 more minutes. Like maybe 2, but not 18. Come on.
I think one thing with Wilder is, he never really did short films. If you look at the running time of his, even when you didn't generally get longer running times. Even Double Indemnity is an hour and 3/4, which is long for a 40s film. But he never ever overstayed his welcome. So even something like Irma la Douce, which is like 2.5 hours, there's not a scene that overstays its welcome. And I can't believe 18 minutes of what? He wouldn't have unnecessarily shown a huge court case. And what would they have done?
The only thing that ever seems to keep showing up is the same 1 or 2 stills from the gas chamber. I don't think I've seen any other images of a courthouse or anything else, which makes me think there was probably maybe the one scene, and whatever length it was, unless it was an 18-minute scene, I tend to agree that we'd probably have seen evidence of other locations, other things that would have happened.
Yeah, no, it doesn't really make a lot of sense, does it?
But I'm glad they ended it where they did, and I can almost feel where they probably went back and did the reshoot just to kind of wind things up, like during that last little bit after he leaves the office. It just feels like, and I'm not going to say tacked on, it just feels like that's probably where the cut would have been. But the way that they end this is as perfect of an ending as you can possibly get.
Yeah, I don't think I wanted to see him go to the chamber.
And it sort of would have been, again, besides, the emotional climax. Ultimately, the heartbreak of the film is that moment. And that's anything, really, there's nothing you could have put on there that wouldn't have felt like you were just winding down.
All right, guys, let's go ahead and take a break, and we'll be back right after these brief messages.
Are you looking for the perfect gift for the cinephile in your life? What if you could give them a whole year of the best documentary and art house films from around the world? Our friends at Ovid.tv are making that easier than ever with a special holiday offer. From now until midnight on Monday, December 2nd, 2019, Ovid.tv is offering 25% off their annual subscriptions. This means you get a whole year of Ovid, the best streaming service for critically acclaimed independent films, for just $52.50 instead of $69.99. Simply head over to www.ovid.tv and use the code THANKS2019 at checkout. Act now. You don't want to miss this.
Hi there, faithful Projection Booth listener, Chris Stashew here. If you're looking for even more deep dive film discussion, both old and new, on and off the cinematic beaten path, check out the Culture Cast. Every episode I'm joined by a different guest as we traverse the cinema landscape talking about not only our monthly theme, but also some of the year's biggest films. I'm even joined by the host of the Projection Booth, the one and only Mike White. So if you want to listen to even more conversations on film, head on over to culturecast.com or find it on all podcatchers, both Android and iOS.
Hello from Cinema Detroit. We are Metro Detroit's only truly independent cinema, and also the only first-run, 7-day-a-week movie theater in Greater Downtown. We deliver an eclectic mix of mainstream, art, indie, genre, cult, and classic movies in the heart of the city. Like a sommelier choosing wine or a DJ mixing a set, we handpick our slate of films, many of which are exclusive to the metro area, the state of Michigan, or the entire Midwest region. Cinema Detroit features a unique setting in a former furniture store and a warm neighborhood atmosphere, including always fresh popcorn, Detroit-made Faygo soda, and other locally created treats. Please visit our website, cinemadetroit.org, for the latest features and showtimes. You can also like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter, Tumblr, and Instagram. We look forward to seeing you soon at 4126 3rd Street in the city, 48201.
I suppose you realize, Mr. Dietrichsen, that since you're not an employee, you're not covered by the normal workman's compensation. The only way you can really be protected is to have a personal policy of your own.
If we bought all the insurance that he carries in that little book, we'd stay broke paying for it, wouldn't we, sweetheart?
What keeps us so broke is you going out and buying 5 pairs of shoes at a crack. You got a policy covering that, Pally?
Dollar for dollar, Mr. Dietrichsen. Accident insurance is the cheapest coverage you can buy.
Well, let's just settle that automobile insurance tonight. I had a tough day.
All right, we're back and talking about Double Indemnity. And, I sometimes say that any good movie deserves a good remake. And Double Indemnity has had a few, including a pretty direct remake from 1973, which has Richard Crenna in it as Walter Neff. This one was interesting to watch.
What was the point in the 1970s? Like, what was the point in it?
I don't know. I mean, were people clamoring?
It's a lot shorter, but almost scene to scene, but missing sort of a lot of other scenes and just...
Well, it just felt like somebody needed to fill 2 hours of television. And, that's always a bad reason to make anything. Look, I think a lot of things have gotten made over the years for film and TV that were because, somebody wanted to create product. And I think, that remake is a perfect example of, someone thought, this is a product we can fill somewhere instead of a story that we're desperate to tell, which to me is all the difference. The 73 remake is, I want to use it as a teacher because it's sort of to me such it proves the value of what actors and directors do in a very graphic way because, I was touching on this before, there are a number of scenes that are literal line-for-line transliterations of the original film, and yet without any of the insight, passion, artistry in the way it's photographed, artistry in the way it's acted. And the same, because the script of this film is always the thing that's really talked about more than anything else, and I agree the script is powerful, but you get to see what happens when the same exact material is put in hands that aren't inspired the way that Wilder was inspired and the people around him were. And it's fascinating to see how the same dialogue that sounds so brilliant in the original just kind of goes off a cliff in the 73 version.
Well, it's dead behind the eyes, that film. I know that's a cruel thing to say, but it's just totally dead. It has none of the tension, none of the eroticism. Like, just that even though they're saying the same things, Keith's right, it's just there's nothing there.
The supposed dialogue is cut in half, and it doesn't make any sense the way that they just end it abruptly with, like, suppose I write you a ticket, and then it's done. It's like, well, what about the whole thing about busted out crying and crying on my husband's shoulder. I mean, it just adds to it and makes it so great. But then there's this just strange cut and we go off to the next thing. And
I believe in this state there's a 65-mile-an-hour speed limit.
Oh, really? Well, how fast was I going, officer?
I'd say about 90.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Dietrichsen. Tomorrow evening at 8:30 then.
Mm-hmm.
The one thing I really liked about this movie is I'm a huge fan of 12 Angry Men, and this was like a 12 Angry Men reunion because you got Lee J. Cobb, you got Robert Webert, and you got John Fielder as Mr. Jackson from Medford, Oregon, and that's about it. You know, it's just like, oh, okay, here are these guys that I like a lot from 12 Angry Men.
Unfortunately, it didn't have the tension of 12 Angry Men, though, did it?
It just didn't seem to have any tension at all, which was kind of sad. And I guess there's a little irony that Richard Crenna would go on to be in Body Heat, because I know some people will say, oh, Body Heat's a remake, but there's enough differences. I mean, Larry Kasdan doesn't credit the original stuff in his screenplay, but my God, there are a lot of similarities between Body Heat and Double Indemnity. You've got John Hurt as a scuzzy lawyer, and he is seducing / being seduced by Kathleen Turner. And I remember this movie, I can't say vividly from when I was younger, but I remember this was forbidden fruit. I could not watch Body Heat. And so when I finally went and watched it just a few years ago, I was just like, oh, what's all the big deal about? There's some sexy stuff in here. And, you know, Kathleen Turner was definitely one of my childhood crushes after seeing her in Crimes of Passion.
I really like Body Heat. I really like it. In fact, I probably saw it before I saw Double Indemnity, but didn't really make the connection at the time. There's just, I love a good sleazy 80s or 90s thriller. They're so trashy, but I just love them. They're like, but yeah, I love Kathleen Turner. I just think it's so fucking sleazy, and everyone's got the sweat running off them, and it's got that. The John Barry score is like it's on some sort of drugs, because at every scene it's like emphasizing the point with this. And it's so out there that I really enjoy it. Whether it's a fitting tribute for Billy Wilder, I don't know. But yeah, I do really enjoy it. But it's so trashy. It's like a soap opera version.
I guess for me, it sort of feels like the difference is that, again, and it feels like, to me, a pastiche. It feels like somebody is doing noir and doing it, you know, very well. But I feel very aware of it, calculating its effects. Whereas, again, when Wilder was doing Double Indemnity, those effects were to tell the story. You know, there was no concept of film noir. It was all the lighting, all the bars created by putting lights through Venetian blinds. All that stuff was really to kind of trap the characters and tell a story. And by the time of Body Heat, I feel just very aware that I'm watching really good filmmakers doing a style, as opposed to a really great filmmaker in Wilder creating a style as a way of getting into the soul of characters. And for me, that's a huge difference in terms of my experience with, you know, anytime you feel that change.
I do enjoy those later noirs, but they are like heavily, deliberately stylized. So I don't know if Body Heat is that much. It does have certain aspects of it, but on a pro for Body Heat, you don't get the blowjob scene where the way he's recognised. Come on, that was good.
That was good, yeah. I mean, yeah, we've got that implied coitus that happens in Double Indemnity, but it is made so explicit, and it really does show. I mean, there was question as far as why does Walter Neff go with Phyllis Dietrichsen? Why does that happen? And, you know, the answer from some critics is, well, she gave him a boner, and there you go. But in this one, it is made very explicit why Ned Racine falls for Maddie Walker. And it's like, okay, yeah, because she is an amazing lay, and they just fuck all the time. And it works. And this is William Hurt in 1984, and he's looking pretty damn good, or 1981, I should say. Though I have to say, I couldn't take my eyes off of Mickey Rourke and Ted Danson, those guys were just a sandwich.
The whole thing, though, is so... It's got this... Because it's set in the heat wave, isn't it? So that's the whole thing with the body heat. And everyone's sweating. And it's just so dirty. And you wonder why everyone's in this film. And it kind of feels wrong, but you can't stop watching it. Mickey Rourke is an explosives expert who's also like a petty criminal. Masterpiece.
Him lip-syncing to Bob Seger really took me by surprise.
And Kathleen Turner's just so good. I love her anyway, and she's just so good. She was one of the best 80s femme fatales, I think. Man with Two Brains as well. Oh God, even in War of the Roses. I mean, she's just such an amazing bitch, wasn't she? She made a huge impact on my young mind when I was a kid growing up.
Well, her in Romancing the Stone and Jewel of the Nile.
Just so good. Yeah, I mean, she was wasn't this like a breakout role though? No, Man with Two Brains was before this, wasn't it?
I think it was the same year, but I'm not sure which one came out first. Though I have to say, Man with Two Brains was 1983. I have to say that when I was rewatching Double Indemnity last night, I was cracking up at the supermarket scene because I just kept expecting Phyllis to turn her head and that it would be Steve Martin underneath that wig. Because I saw Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid so many times when I was growing up, and I didn't even know what these movies were, and then it's like years later I would catch little bits and I'd be like, oh my God, that's from Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid. This is fantastic.
I'm crazy about you, baby.
I'm crazy about you too, Walter.
Perfume. What's the name of it?
Fondle me. Silly. That's the name of the perfume.
Now you've said that, actually, because Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid and The Man with Two Brains, they were two films that I watched. I said I watched Double Indemnity with my dad when I was older, but Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid I watched as a kid. Like, we watched all the Mel Brooks comedies, and that was the one that we would watch over and over, and I had no clue what the films were. Like, none. And now you said that, it's like, I didn't, because my dad loves old classic film, but we actually saw that first, and a few years before as well.
I remember a making of about Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid where they were talking about having to match the grain from the different films and the way that they would have to manipulate their footage to make it integrate with the older movies. And so when I'm seeing this beautiful Blu-ray of Double Indemnity, I'm just like, I wonder if they could go back now and restore Dead Men Don't Wear Plaid and make it all look as good as this.
I really want to go and watch it again because it's been so long since I've seen it.
I don't know if Body Heat was the first of the erotic thrillers, but to me it definitely kind of set that tone, and there were other ones that were coming out around the same time that also played into that noir thing, like Against All Odds and some other ones, and then it kind of morphed into that more Fatal Attraction, Basic Instinct kind of mold. But this one was definitely one of the sexier ones to me, though it has nothing on the 1977 film Eruption.
Thanks for that, Mike.
Yeah, that is Sam Norville, who goes by Stanley Curlin in this one, and that is the one and only Mr. John Holmes as Pete Winston, an insurance agent who I'm not sure if he's just on vacation in Hawaii or if he lives there, but they're definitely using that Hawaii location to the best of its ability and transporting Double Indemnity from Los Angeles over to the island and throwing in sex at every turn. And I especially appreciate that they really make explicit that the Nino character is fucking both the mother and the daughter, though not at the same time in this movie. That is something that you have to go to Pornhub these days for. I'm sorry, my friend, but...
Which one was Nino? Was he the guy in the gym?
I thought that Nino was the guy at the pool.
Who was the guy in the gym with
that white man's afro and that crazy mustache?
Yeah, that guy. Who was he supposed to be? 'Cause he starts having a threesome in the gym, and I just thought, who is this? Who is this? I was actually, trying to make a serious comparison because of this podcast.
Yeah, I was lost through a lot of this as far as who was who, though there are some lines. John Holmes is dropping some lines right from the original, so I'm like, wow, okay.
You salesmen are all alike. Timing's wrong. Too aggressive. Slow down. Don't you know there's a speed limit on this island? 55 miles per hour.
Uh-huh. And how fast would you say I was going?
100 miles per hour.
100. Why don't you pull me over and give me a ticket?
Is that all you want, a ticket?
Well, never mind what I want. How about what you want?
Yeah, there are a lot of times where I'm like, I'm not sure where I'm at with this story. Is this something to do with Lola or something to do with Phyllis? I can't really figure out what's happening right now. Yeah, who are these people? Why are they having sex? And then some of the acting limitations.
The murder's good, though, because the murder is great. The way they fake. It's done on, like, the boat with the diving accident. They bring him out. They bring out John Holmes as the husband, and I can't think he plays the husband, but John Holmes is acting as the husband. He's doing the whole broken leg thing, and they bring him out on the jetty in broad daylight. Looks nothing like the other dude, and he's about I don't know, 15 feet from them, and then they pretend he's drowned off the side of this boat in broad daylight, and then the guy who's watching was like, I knew when he fell off the boat he had a 50-50 chance. It's just like... But it was definitely him. He doesn't look anything like the guy. He doesn't even try... He just puts a cast on. It's great.
I think he says something about, I have a similar shirt. And that, yeah. I mean, John Holmes... We all know what John Holmes looks like. And this other guy, he looks closer to William Hurt than John Holmes. I mean, it just... He's tall, he's blonde, yeah, just totally different.
And they're just on this jetty a few feet away, waving at these people who would be thinking, who's that with? What's her name?
Well, he kissed her on the back of the hand, though. That's what the husband always does.
Kiss me on the hand. Kisses are on something else as well.
I really appreciated the use of the split screen when there was some fellatio going on. That was kind of nice. There was a lot of fellatio in that movie. Speaking of fellatio and speaking of Jism, I couldn't believe that this movie from India from 2003, so the word for body apparently in this language is Jism, for fuck's sake. So there I am looking up Jism 2003, and did I find a lot of interesting pictures.
I've been laughing about this all week, and that's no disrespect to Bollywood, but I've just been laughing about this all week. I just keep saying Jism.
I know. I feel like we're some like lame-ass podcast where we're a bunch of, giggling assholes, but my God, is it so funny to have an erotic thriller just named Jism, for fuck's sake.
It's actually very, very similar to Body Heat, apart from the fucking songs. Oh, God, the songs.
Well, to me, it was kind of a mashup of Body Heat and Double Indemnity, because there's a couple things where I'm just like, oh, okay, this is right out of Double Indemnity.
Oh, yeah. It's. I think their main reference is Body Heat, though, as they kept the wind chime thing. I mean, it looks really pretty. It's a pretty film. But it's over 2 hours long.
Well, welcome to Bollywood, right?
Yeah, and like when you've watched so many, when you've gone through the 1973 remake, and it's just like, fucking hell, Mike. What you do? I'm just going to stick Jism on now, 2 hours, 13 minutes. It's like, of the same story that you just watched the day before. Oh, thank you. No. I like the little song when he did the murder, though, showing that he was, regretful. And also, because it was interesting, we're talking about Chandler being an alcoholic, which isn't really part of Double Indemnity, but there's this weird thing about alcoholism in Jism. Like, the main guy seems to have a drink problem. The stepdaughter seems to have a drink problem. There's that scene in it where his cop friend casts him out from his house for coming in drunk. And the main protagonist is, like, rolling around the streets, like, crying, drunk out of his mind. He's ringing up the Phyllis Dietrichsen woman, you know, when she's having a party with her husband and being all jealous, and he's so much throwing glasses across the room. And
I was surprised at how hot the movie was, because we talked about on the Body Double episode that there's a Bollywood version of Body Double, and they have to take, Holly Body, they take her from dancing naked in front of a window to her, just basically doing like a Bollywood dance in front of a window. And whenever they have sex, it's the characters are basically like kissing and hugging, and that's their equivalent. And watching this, I was like, oh wow, they're kind of going out on a limb here. This is there's some eroticism to this.
No, it is quite steamy in parts. It is quite. I don't know anything about Bollywood, by the way, so I don't know if this was typical or not. But the scenes, the love scenes were quite steamy. I could have just done with about half an hour less of it. I was jismed out by the end of it.
Kat, just so you know, there is a sequel.
Yeah, I know. I do. There's a Jism too.
So if you're craving more Jism, Kat, I know where you can get some.
I would love to have known what Wilder thought of these more erotic, exotic remakes, because by 1981, it was 1981 when he did Buddy Buddy, which is his last film, which I love. I know he hated it, though. He felt that cinema had become too graphic and too grotesque. I mean, that one's great. I don't know if either of you guys have seen it. It's Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau. Walter Matthau's a hitman, and Jack Lemmon's going to commit suicide in the hotel room next door. And he's disturbing Walter Matthau, who's trying to make a hit. So that's the concept. But Jack Lemmon's wife is run off with Klaus Kinski, who owns a sex sort of guru retreat. And it's so that's quite crude for a Wilder, but even in that, he didn't feel comfortable about that. So I wonder what he would have made of Jism. I don't know whether he would have approved. I think Wilder was at his best always within the Code era and the pre-Code era. Because where he was really good was, and he learnt a lot of this from Lubitsch, was getting around those limitations. And so with things like Double Indemnity, it becomes so clever because it's right out there in the open, but it's not. There's nothing the censors can actually do about it because it's so... and that's where he worked best. And then when the Hays Code slipped away and cinema changed, I think Wilder found himself a bit out of place there, and it was harder for him. I mean, I love all his films, even the later ones, but I know his last film he wasn't happy with, and he wasn't happy with how cinema had changed. And there just isn't the appreciation for that sort of subtlety either anymore. So bring back the innuendo. It's sexier than Jism.
I always say that cinema is better when it has restraints to it, and the way that people will go about getting around those. I mean, we've talked so many times about Czechoslovakian films made during the Russian occupation, and it's just like, yeah, there you go. Here's a pretty big censorship thing that you need to get around, and the way that they did was pretty fantastic.
Oh, you get so much ingenuity. Like, when everything is allowed, it's no longer... I don't know, there's nothing subversive or naughty about it, and it takes the edge off. It's like when you can drink and you're an adult, it's not as good. It's like the same thing. But then you look at some pre-code films like Morocco, for example. Me and Sam did commentary for that recently. And there's a scene in that where Gary Cooper comes into this club and he's talking to this hostess or barmaid or whatever she is. I can't remember the line. I was trying to think of this yesterday. It's nothing about hand jobs, but you listen to it and you think, did he just ask her for a hand job? But it's like that, and I have to remember the line, but it's just like, whoa. Because they couldn't do that, it just becomes a bit more sophisticated. And of course, I love erotic cinema. I write so much about European erotic cinema, but I do really, really appreciate the sophistication of people like Wilder and Lubitsch and von Sternberg, had to work around these very rigid Puritan codes. There's just something the anarchist in me just loves the whole thing about it. And it also requires a little bit of brain power to understand it as well. So I like that as well. If you're in on the joke with them, it feels kind of special.
Well, there's also, for me as a viewer, there's like this bell curve of eroticism. I mean, it's like, if you're talking about almost like, actual real pornography where people are actually having sex, there's an eroticism there that I can get. But when you're dealing with kind of a fake sexuality, which is what I think of like a Hollywood sexuality, in some ways the innuendo is much hotter than watching actors not having sex to me. It's like watching faking it just always feels like I'm very aware I'm watching actors faking it. Whereas when good actors have real sexual tension between them and it's going on in the scene and in the dialogue, my heart's racing a lot more than when I go, oh yeah, and they're both kind of clothed just below camera and whatever. I mean, I just feel like it to me it's very hard to make that particularly erotic. And the earlier films where it's done by implication, I actually find that I feel a lot more.
Oh, it's more teasing. You have to work harder to figure it out. You get a lot more tension in it. Whereas in something like Body Heat, instead of this very veiled scene where you think afterwards, hey, if they just had sex, you get Kathleen Turner splayed out like a starfish with her ass out, and it's just not the same. It's not the same. It's just like, where's the mystery?
All right, guys, we're going to take another break and play a preview for next week's show.
Why'd you come here?
Where I come from, there's a terrible drought. We saw pictures of your planet on television. We saw the water. In fact, our word for your planet means planet of water.
I like figs. That's why I like you. Oh, I guess that was happening to you.
In, say, 3 years, what would this be worth to me?
$300 million?
Not more. I need more.
What the hell for?
That's right, we'll be back next week with a look at Nicholas Roeg's The Man Who Fell to Earth. Until then, I want to thank this week's co-hosts, Kat and Keith. So, Keith, what is happening in your world lately, sir?
I just finished doing an episode. Jason Segel's got this new show that he's creating for AMC called Dispatches from Elsewhere, and I really like it. It's really odd and weird and fanciful and whimsical, and he wrote the pilot and directed it and plays one of the leads in it, and I think he kind of has created something sort of wonderful. So I just went and directed an episode of it and really, really enjoyed it, and so I'm kind of looking forward to seeing how it all pieces together. It's a genre that I'm very drawn to. It's just kind of a slightly surrealist, but there's an odd sweetness to it all. I mean, it reminds me a little bit of something like Time Bandits or something, where it's a little bit of an alternate universe and very playful. It's like a fable it's like a kid's book for adults sort of feeling, and so it was really lovely to work on.
Anything else in the hopper?
Well, that and I have my passion projects that I'm endlessly trying to inch along. I'm also going to go off and do 2 episodes of Fargo, for this 4th season of Fargo. It's being shot now. I keep going back to that show because I love working on things that I love as a viewer, and I really enjoy Noah Hawley's writing and his work. So I'm going to go back and do the last two episodes of season 4, for some of the winter, and then I got the movies I've been trying to make for 15 years that I just go back to again.
And Kat, what has been keeping you busy until Brexit finally happens?
I've been really, really, really busy this month, actually, but most of the things I can't say what they are. But I'm still hammering away on Castrobot. It's coming. I commissioned the cover the other day. And what else? Our Michael Reeves documentary that I wrote and co-produced called The Magnificent Obsession of Michael Reeves, about the British filmmaker Michael Reeves, who died very young. We did a documentary on his life and his work. That is actually now available through Annelies in Germany. Have done a Blu-ray of Reeves is the Sorcerer, so it's exclusive to that because Annelies produced it as well. We've done the festivals. So now people can actually buy that if they buy the Sorcerer's disc, but they were not going to be able to. I've had people going, I'm going to wait till it comes on iTunes. And I just think it's never going to come on iTunes. So just, you have to buy the disc. Sorry. It's not happening. I did a thing for Arrow's release of Nightbreed, which just came out, and got to talk all about Clive Barker and decadence and the occult and all my favourite things. And then commentary-wise, I did Roger Vadim's version of Dangerous Liaisons, which came out by Kino. I did a booklet essay for the Old Boy limited edition release, which has all the Vengeance films on it. And what else? And then The Whisperers and The Owl-Shaped Room for Kino as well, commentaries on them, which are two just really great classic British films. So I got to talk all about my class chip and upper class people and how I can't stand them and all that sort of stuff. I'm sure Americans won't be able to understand those, though.
You mean just because of your accent?
My dialect, Mike. Call blimey governor.
Well, thank you again, guys, for being on the show. Thanks to everybody for listening. Please head on over to the website, projectionboothpodcast.com, where you can find out more about today's episode. You also find a link over to Patreon, where you can make a donation to the show. Every donation we get helps the Projection Booth take over the world.
If you enjoy this show and want more people to know about it, head on over to iTunes, leave a comment, and rate it 5 stars. Make sure you like and share us on Facebook, and don't forget to follow us on Twitter. Just search for Christopher Media. Thank you in advance for supporting Christopher Media by clicking on the PayPal button and by clicking through to all the sponsors who support ChristopherMedia.net. Most importantly, we would like to take the time to extend an extra special thanks to you. Christopher Media could not exist without your support. Thank you for visiting ChristopherMedia.net, and thank you for listening. Christopher Media. Let's make some noise.